Let's now shortly go back to asynchronous JavaScript, because there has been an important change in ES 2022. So starting from this new ES 2022 version, we can now use the await keyword outside of async functions, at least in modules. So that's why this is here in the modules section. So again, as I just said, because this is really important, we can now basically use the await keyword outside of an async function, which we call top-level await. Just remember that this only works in modules. If we were going to try this in a normal script, like we have been using before this section, then top-level await would still fail. So it would not work at all. But here in our HTML file, we can still see that we have our type set to module. So this is what is required in order to make top-level await actually work. So to show you top-level await, let's simply do a simple fetch request. So the fetch function, remember, is what we do to do an HTTP or an AJAX request. And now let's use a new API that we haven't used before, which is a very simple one, simply with some fake data. And it's called JSON placeholder. So just Google JSON placeholder, and probably it is then this very first result. And here we can get fake data about posts, comments, albums, and all of this. But here, what I'm interested in is these posts. So just copy this URL here, and then that's really all that we need. So let's put that here. And now it's time to use that top-level await. So we can await the result here and then save it into some variable. All right. But remember that then we need another await to parse the data as JSON. So here I'm not explaining deeply again how all of this works. So how the fetch function works and how the JSON works, because we went through that in great depth in the previous section. Okay, and then we can log the data simply to the console. So let's give it a save and see what happens. And indeed, here is our data. So we have an array of 100 posts here, where each of them is this object here. All right, so basically that's how you use top-level await. And so we see that indeed the await keyword is now working outside of an async function. So before we would have to write async function something and then the function body. But now with top-level await in modules, that is no longer necessary. Now, what's really, really important to understand here is that while this is all great and very useful, this actually blocks the execution of the entire module now. And as we learned in the previous section, that is sometimes not exactly what we want. So let me actually demonstrate that to you by logging something else here afterwards. So just something really. And I will also make this request here a little bit slower. So let's come here to the network tab. And here then I click on throttling, and let's use a slow 3G. Then let's clean this here and reload. So you see that it's now taking up quite some time, and especially now here, this part, where it's actually fetching some data. So let's actually log something here before also. So start fetching. So that will make it a little bit easier to see what's happening. So let's reload here again. So now it all takes a lot of time because the network is really slow. So you see start fetching, then it's doing the work, and only after that it is really logging this something here to the console. And so in fact, this await keyword here, which is now outside of an async function, is blocking the entire execution of this module, which is something that we had never seen before. So this really wasn't possible before we got top-level await in JavaScript. Now, of course, this can be useful in some situations, but many times it can also be harmful, and especially if it's a really long-running task. So just as we learned in the last section, right? And if you don't remember that very important video from the last section, then you can just check it out. I think it's the first video in that previous section. But anyway, long story short, just make sure that you use this new superpower that you just got with great caution. All right. Now, this example here illustrates exactly how top-level await works, but it's a bit too simple. It's not really real world enough. So let's actually get a little bit more real. So many times we have the situations where we do have an async function that we want to return some data. So let's actually try that. And I will just comment out this code here for now. Okay. And so let's create a function here called getLastPost. So this function will basically do this fetch request here and will then only return the very last post. So this is an async function. It doesn't need any input data. And then let's just copy these 2 lines of code here. And let's again actually log that data here so we can take a look at what we receive here. So for now, let's just call it so that this code here actually executes. And to see this, I will now turn off this throttling. So we no longer need this. This was just to show you the blocking effect of top-level await. Okay, so that's pretty fast now. And remember that now we want to return something from this function. And I simply want to return an object which contains the title here and let's see, also the body. So let's say return, and we're going to return a new object with the title of data, which is this entire array here. And then we want to get the last element. Now, how can we do that? Well, let's actually use the new ES2022 add method. And if this is the first time that you're seeing or that you're hearing about the add method, then check out a new video that I also added to the array section. So right at the beginning of that. But anyway, we can just use data.add and then -1, which will basically get the very last element of an array, and then .title. And then the other one is called the body, but let's just call it text here. So text is data at -1 dot body. Give it a save. And now here let's try to save that variable, or actually that returned value, into a variable called lastPost. Okay. Now, if you remember the last section, then you will remember that this is not going to work. So let me show you what lastPost is actually going to be. So you see, it is actually a promise. It is not the object that we were expecting. And the reason for that is that calling an async function, which this function here clearly is, will always return a promise. It will not return the actual data itself, because by the time we are running this line of code here, the data has not yet arrived. So we still have that pending promise. And again, if you don't really remember the specifics here, you can always go back to the last section. All right. Now the workaround that I showed you before, so to actually get this data here, so this object instead of the promise, was to simply use regular promises. So we can take this promise here that is returned and stored in this variable, and then on that we can call the then method. then in the then method, we get access to the resolved value, which we can just call last, and then let's just log it to the console. And of course, it's not called lost, but last. And so after some time, here we get that object. So with the title and the text. However, doing this isn't very clean. Not very clean. And so what we can do now is to use top level await for this. So let's call it last post 2 this time, which will be the result of awaiting get last post. And let's see. Of course, it takes some time, but then here it is. So here is the result of awaiting this promise here now. So the promise returned from this get last post function. And it's in situations like these where top level await actually can get quite useful. All right. Now to finish, I just want to show you one more important implication of using top level await. And that is the fact that if one module imports a module which has a top level await, then the importing module will wait for the imported module to finish the blocking code. So that sounds a bit complicated, and it sounds more complicated than it actually is. So let's just demonstrate this with an example. So let's come here to our shopping cart module, which is a module that we import right here. So remember from the last lecture that here we are importing the shopping cart module. And so let's now just add some blocking code here. So maybe just here in the very beginning. So let's say start fetching users, because this time we will actually fetch users. Let's copy all of this. And this is really just to have some blocking code, so we don't even need to store the result anywhere. And here, instead of posts, we can use users. But in this case, it doesn't really matter because we're actually not even saving the result anymore or anywhere. So finish fetching. All right. And now to see this effect again, we should probably throttle that request again with a slow 3G. So going back here. So the first thing that's going to happen is that the shopping cart is imported. And so now we start immediately the start fetching users. Then only after the fetch is completed, we get this second console log here. So that's this one. And only after all that, the code in the importing module, so in script.js, is actually executed. So let's see that again in action. And so we will now be able to see that the code in script.js actually has to wait for the code in shopping-cart.js to finish. So this top-level await that we have here is in fact blocking the execution not only in this module, but also in the module that is importing it. So again, it's very important to remember that using top-level await, so await outside of any async function, will block the entire module in a way that we really couldn't block code execution before. And so this is not only a really helpful tool, but also one that we need to use with great care. But anyway, let's now deactivate this code here so that it's not going to block when we start going to the next lectures. All right. And so, yeah, I think we're finished here. This is how top-level await works. And so let's now go straight to the next video.